Very much, Piera, and welcome to everyone to our third lecture in the lecture series, Illocutionary Objects, Lived Religion. I'm Joseph Sanzo, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion, which is putting on this lecture series, and working together with Piera Tallinn, who is doing a lot of the legwork behind this lecture series and is doing a fantastic job. So I'm thankful very much for Piera's work. We have our third lecture in this series today by Matteo Benussi. Matteo Benussi is a social and cultural anthropologist based at Foscari's Department of Humanities, specializing in religion, politics, and space making in Eurasia. He has conducted research on Islamic piety movements in Tatarstan, the legacies of Chernobyl in Ukraine, and post-Soviet heritage dynamics. He is currently exploring topics of war, poetry, time, and political theology, as well as ontology, amid Eurasia's geopolitical convulsions. Today, Matteo will be presenting a paper called Outrageous Illocutions, Extraordinary Speech, Fidelity, and Ethical Intensity Among Tatarstani Muslim Pietists. Matteo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for the presentation. Thanks, Piera, for setting this up and inviting me here. I'm so glad to see you all in this virtual space. Thank you for showing up. And without further ado, let me share my screen. And hopefully, well, we tested it earlier, so it should work. Sweet. Right, I changed something in the wording. So although the title is Illocutions, please don't be too worried if you hear a lot of utterances. Do consider those words interchangeably, although of course we can unpack the implications of using one or the other in the Q&A session. So today's presentation is based on a chapter of my new book, and I apologize for the self-promotion, but I'm very excited about it coming out just a few weeks ago. So do check out the website of Cornell University Press. You'll find there's also a link to download it for a very reasonable price. Sorry for that. I felt I needed to say it, but I am indeed very excited about this development. And the things I'm going to talk about today are very much part of a broader mosaic of reflections and ethnographic observations that I have condensed in this book. Anyways, in the first part of this presentation, I will give a few examples of the illicit linguistic objects that interest me here. That is outrageous illocutions or utterances by Muslim revivalists in Russia's Tatarstan Republic, which you can see here, located in the Volga region, this part of the Russian Federation. And the shaded area here is stands for the areas where which have been historically or are still predominantly inhabited by Muslim population. So not everybody knows that this part of Central Russia is and has been historically dominated demographically by Muslim populations for a very long time, even though it is now extensively secularized. So after the kind of ethnographic vignettes, I will then zoom out and try to discuss the theoretical implications of the material I present today. My main contention is that the outrageousness of the statement at issue today has less to do with whether revivalists, Muslim revivalists, believe in the content of these statements, and I mean believe as a discrete cognitive activity, and more to do with what these speech acts do to the ethical and political subjectivities of their utterance, as well as how they impact on the broader moral and discursive landscape around them. I will argue that these utterances are outrageous because they simultaneously index the extraordinarily intense ethical commitment of their utterers, and they breach a tacit set of norms regulating the field of discourse of Islam in Russia. So it is very much ethical intensity expressed in and through speech. And as such, it has, I will hopefully make this clear, this point clear as my argument develops, it has an inherent autonomizing dimension. Let me spend a word or two on the context of my research. For the purposes of this presentation, the important thing to know about Tatarstan is that it is a relatively easy thing to be a Muslim there. The current Russian regime, which is, among other things, conservative, moralist, and traditionalist, has invested heavily in religion and the quote-unquote protection of believers. It actively supports what it calls traditional faiths, including Islam, and has endowed the state with Islamic bureaucracies catering specifically to Muslim citizens. Yet, Russia's post-atheist balancing act between promoting religion and maintaining a secular order means that Islamic life and Islamic discourse is supposed to remain within well-established limits. Russia's traditional Islam is supposed to be modern and enlightened. It ought to be moderate and sensible, and it must adhere to a pluralist and tolerant model of society where all religions are equal, although maybe one of them, Orthodox Christianity, is a bit more equal than the others. Official Islamic institutions are supposed to both develop domestic Islamic discourse and police its boundaries. In this context, being caught saying something that can be construed as extremist may have serious consequences for Muslims, including jail or exile. This is something that outrageous utterers are well aware of, but they do it nonetheless. So let me provide a few examples of the utterances, the illocutions I want to talk about. I was once mid-fieldwork and was invited to a private gathering involving a handful of male pietists belonging to the scripturalist mosque community that I was researching. We sipped tea and talked about religion. At one point, my acquaintances began discussing the lives of ancient prophets. Is it true that Prophet Adam, peace be upon him, was much taller than men are today? Asked Selimjan Efendi, the host. Of course, he was about 30 meters tall, just a bit less. Bulat Abi confidently replied, followed by a round of nods and expressions of mild amazement, mashallah. Men were much larger back then, and also they lived way longer. Yes, Ibrahim Abi interjected casually. Adam lived 1,000 years, and Prophet Nuh, peace be upon him, reached the age of 950 years. The tone of the exchange, at once enthusiastic and matter-of-factly, struck me. While at the beginning of the meeting I had felt comfortable actively participating in the conversation, now I just hoped I was managing to camouflage my puzzlement. Over the months, I had acquainted myself with the sermons of local imams. I attended classes on halal business or family life at the local mosque, and I had come to feel that I knew how to navigate my interlocutors' worlds. Yet at that moment, I found myself uncomfortably distant from them. What they were saying was just preposterous to me. My acquaintances, whom I knew as pragmatic, competent, well-educated individuals who had received far enough schooling and information and education to master the basics of biology and archaeology, must have been aware of how outlandish such claims would have sounded to most people outside of that circle. And they were, but they would still utter them. Sometime afterwards, I joined another group of men for some downtime at the cabin that one of them owned in the woodland nearby. After dinner, we availed ourselves to our host's rustic sauna. My burly, bearded companions and I sat amid the resin-scented steam, panting slightly, wearing felt hats to protect our heads from overheating, and knee-length towels to protect our bodies from immodesty. Before long, our conversation shifted to the topic of interfaith dialogue. In Russia, they say they're Christian, Ayratabi told us, with a tone of conspiratorial gravitas. But these Christians don't truly respect Jesus. After that, he added emphatically, almost like he was speaking to himself, "If you ask me, I am prepared to die at any moment for the sake of Prophet Jesus, Prophet Isa, peace be upon him." How many of them can say the same? The other guests joined in with other remarks to that effect, uttered with calm intensity. By all means, one should be ready to lie one's life for the honor of Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. Once again, I was taken by surprise. Martyrdom and the merest mention of the possibility of faith-related violence are never voiced in the Tatar mainstream. Indeed, when this kind of speech does percolate out of safe, intimate contexts, trouble does ensue. In late 2020, a Russian Islamic website published an open letter titled, "Will Non-Muslims be saved in the afterlife?" Arguing on pretty well-developed theological grounds that no, non-Muslims cannot be saved in the afterlife. After addressing the readers as "dear Muslims," the author went on to argue that a lenient doctrine of salvation is based on arbitrary interpretation of scripture and risks legitimizing Muslims' deviation from correct faith. So, intrigued, I followed the document around Russian language social media and noticed that it garnered approving comments from pious users in Islamic channels. There was debate, of course, and heated, but it was theological, erudite debate on matters of interpretation. However, the letter had also became a matter of contention on a popular open-to-all Q&A website, which is a little bit like a Russian Reddit. One user, an ethnic Russian who identified as Orthodox Christian, polemically copy-pasted the letter to support his claim that the Islamic doctrine of salvation was not only, and I quote, "widely unfair," but also unreasonable and offensive to non-Muslims. Judging by the indignant response he generated, the user was successful in capitalizing on the outrage potential of a text that was not meant for a wide readership, but addressed only fellow scripturalists. Recall the "dear Muslims" incipit. Regardless of its writer's lack of an explicit intention to offend, the article was doomed to come across as hurtful, and even worse, as incompatible with the values of conservative pluralism and harmonious tolerance promoted by the Russian state, with all its potential consequences. The questions I ask in my project are: what is it exactly that makes such speech acts outrageous? If they are outrageous, what makes them utterable and even desirably utterable, even needed? What effects do they have on the subjectivities of their utterers, their intended recipients, and also eavesdroppers? What happens if they fall on unintended ears or reverberate across the mainstream? My hypothesis is that utterances such as "ancient humans were 30 meters tall," or "I am ready to die for the sake of Prophet Jesus," or "only Muslims will be saved," and other illocutions like those, speech acts that revivalists know sound strange but utter nonetheless, they belong in a domain of speech whose function, for want of a less old-fashioned word, whose function is to index the intensity of their utterers' ethical striving on the path of becoming fully fledged Muslims. An intense commitment to Islam is key to pietist asceticism, and this reflects in all domains of action, including those of conversation and speech. Expressing the truth of Islam in speech with full-throated conviction is vital to my interlocutors' overall self-cultivation endeavor, however much it disrupts the established order of the discourse around them. Now, because I love neologisms, I propose to call this kind of speech fidemic, with fidem or fidim being a unit of language expressing a subject's fidelity to an ethical norm and the truth underpinning it. It is, of course, a playful calque on the terms phonetic and phoneme and related linguistic concepts, and I'm mildly embarrassed by it, but it's too late now, the book is published. These fidemic utterances overlap with, but cannot be reduced to, other linguistic phenomena that they may be confused with. They are not ritualized formulas such as, say, the Shahada, the statement of faith. They are not a rite of passage into a faith community, but rather statements that express a subject's ongoing adherence to the norms of that community. Indeed, they are not uttered liturgically, but in a matter-of-fact, commonsensical way. They're just part of who you are as a disciplined scripturalist Muslim. They are not paresia. The Greek candid speech was made abundantly well known by philosopher Michel Foucault, insofar as they are not about speaking your mind in the presence of somebody powerful, but they're really just about expressing a religious verity that you happen to live by. Finally, they should not be conflated with secular varieties of offensive speech, for their intent is not to hurt, mock, or offend. Those are consequences that might happen, but they depend on the susceptibility of the listeners. Yet those utterances are indeed exclusive. Whoever is not part of the ethical community in question will feel, if not offended, at least disconcerted by them. A corollary to my argument is that fidemic speech is autonomous speech and even more autonomizing speech. I argue that autonomy here is literally self-nomos, autonomos, self-rule, self-mastery, and it is central to ethical life, in particular to ethics understood, as I do in this presentation and many others, as the embodiment of virtues through pious self-cultivation. Framed in these terms, autonomy is not an abstract liberal value, but a relationship between the subject and a set of norms on the one hand, and between the subject and truth on the other. This is a lot, but I hope I will unpack it in the remainder of this presentation. Let me explain what I mean by likening autonomy or connecting autonomy to a relationship to norm. Drawing from Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, I observed that norm can decline itself in at least two ways, as law and as rule. Law is norm as defined and as implemented by institutions, apparatuses, governing bodies, and so forth. But also norm as it becomes naturalized, even weaponized, as common sense, custom, or tradition. The conceit of traditional Islam, as defined by Tatarstan's Islamic bureaucracy, enforced through the state's coercive and ideological means, is an example of Islam as law. Rule, by contrast, is known as a self-chosen framework for self-governing, open to periodical reappraisal and reflexive scrutiny, and enacted through willed action and speech. It is Islam as rule that underpins high-intensity ethical projects such as the Islamic revival in Tatarstan. Now, let me be quite clear that law and rule are not at war with each other and are not incompatible. In this case, it's all Islam. It's kind of in a spectrum, but they do stand in tension, and understanding this tension is crucial to sort of appreciate the political predicament of Muslim revivalists in Russia. To bring into focus autonomy as a subject's relationship to truth, I turn to French post-Maoist thinker Alain Badiou. In Badiou's theory of ethics, ethical life is about the practical realization of commitment to a truth. Crucially to our purposes today, Badiou emphasizes that the kind of truth in the plural underlying ethical projects are not about facticity, they're not factual truth, they're not well-informed opinions, they are not evidence-based statements, they are not theories corroborated by experiments, they're not, say, about applying the means of archaeology or biology to determine the height of ancient humans. The kind of truth as an ethical object discussed here is not objectively true, but is subjectively true. It is a radical, totalizing, world upending intimation of something vast and binding, polar star that has the power to change mind and reorient action. Badiou had communism in mind when he developed his theory, but the argument can and has been extended to religious revelation as well. An ethical truth is such only insofar as people are fidelious to it, but this fidelity has observable, objective, real-world effects. In the pursuit of truth, ethical subjects challenge received wisdom, shake the foundation of the old order, and annoy everybody in the process. I think that this line of reasoning casts a very revealing light on the Islamic revival in Tatarstan, where a new generation of mostly young and well-educated truth chasers challenged both the legacy of state atheism and the Putin regime's neo-traditionalist weaponization of religion. So, standing on the shoulders of such giants as Agamben and Badiou, the claim I make is that fidemic speech acts, including utterances about ancient prophets being giants, are autonomizing in the literal etymological sense of expressing, in the domain of speech, the self-rule, the autonomous of a subject in pursuit of a truth. What then are we to make of those speech acts' outrageousness? Again, etymology is of some help. Fidemic speech is outrageous in the original sense of outrage, from the root ultra, meaning something that steps beyond. Fidemic speech subtracts, so to speak, the utterer from the domain of the customarily correct, the traditionally commonsensical, the institutionally sanctioned. It is therefore inherently political, because violating or even extracting oneself from the normative grid of discursive law means to evade or subvert the dominant ordering of power relations. Hence, even if my interlocutors are not particularly keen on feuding with the official Islamic bureaucracy, let alone with the Putin regime itself. Remember that the book is titled Restless Quietists. They're not Islamists. They're not spoiled for a fight. They're very much keen to be left alone. And yet, their actions and speech acts are and will be received as dangerously excessive. Such a regime like Putin's, bent on creating a morally regulated, well-governed public in Russia, will feel threatened by the excessive quality of fidemic speech because, regardless of what we might think of its content, such formal excessiveness has a real emancipatory potential. And I will come to this in a second. This is not only relevant in the context of the politics of Islamic piety in contemporary Russia, it is also relevant, and this is the final part of my presentation, because it invites us to rethink the ways in which anthropological discussions of ethical life have addressed or failed to address the topic of freedom. Emancipation, freedom, autonomy, these are far from unproblematic concepts in anthropological discussions about Islamic ethics. Indeed, some of the most influential scholarship that has emerged in recent decades has explicitly sought to get rid of such notions. Consider the families of studies and theories influenced by the great anthropologist Talal Asad. These approaches have managed to bring us closer to an internal understanding of religious life by framing religions as ethical traditions endowed with their own intrinsic conceptions of the good that we should try to grasp and comprehend on their own terms. Those studies also mounted a severe critique of the idea that values considered totemic in liberal modernity, such as freedom or agency, should be cast as universal aspirations. Ethical life in Muslim settings, they argued, is about inhabiting the norms handed down through tradition, not trying to break free from them. So fixating on Western ideals such as personal sovereignty, autonomy, and so forth would just throw us off the tracks. Now, although widely acknowledged as a major intellectual breakthrough, these approaches have also been met with pushback. Subsequent studies have added nuance to the picture, evidencing how the conceit of wholly coherent ethical traditions is often belied by religionists' everyday experience. At the strict level, the counter-argument goes, people navigate a variety of moral repertoires and value systems, some of them religious or Islamic, some of them may well include liberty-related concepts such as independence or self-determination and so forth. But this counter-argument has engendered a counter-argument. Here you go, the original camp would say. Now, of course, there's not such thing as two camps. I'm over-dramatizing here, but just for the sake of argument. So here you go. you're actually confirming the original claim by postulating a neutral frame, which is a classical liberal move, where the free modern subject exercises his or her sovereign license by cherry picking values and syncretizing diverse ethical systems. This can only happen insofar as religions have been subjugated and relativized by the advent of a secular order. But even in such a scenario, freedom only makes sense as negative freedom, freedom as unconstrained choice, which is indeed extrinsic from the moral repertoires of religions themselves. So the sort of the retort is, well, there might be such thing as freedom, liberty, but it's something external, extrinsic to the ethical traditions. And this in turn has given rise to a counter argument. How about free will? Surely no ethical tradition can claim to be ethical if it does not presuppose religionist responsibility, the kind of margin, the sort of maneuvering room to either embrace or reject the teachings of a faith, either follow or ignore its doctrines. Therefore, even the most normative ethical tradition must at some point allow for its followers free will. Now, this debate has been incredibly important and should and will go on, and therefore will carry on for the foreseeable future. But what I am trying to do in my project is to sort of disturb the symmetry between these two positions. And I'm trying to do so by sort of rewinding the discussion back to the point where the topic of the issue of autonomy was either discarded as an unnecessary secularist distraction or cast only in negative terms as the ability of making unconstrained decisions, and instead push the debate on freedom in a new direction, and a more radical direction concerned with the emancipatory potential of ethics. A reframing of autonomy as self-rule in pursuit of a doxa-defined truth can provide fresh insight into the emancipatory, politically disruptive, and indeed even joyfully anarchic quality of demanding ethical disciplines, both within and without the Islamic tradition. This kind of ethical work on the self may and will be perceived as outrageous by onlookers, as today's examples hopefully have shown. But its importance is that it points to a quest for emancipated, for autonomized life that must be recognized as central to many forms of religious experience, including very high intensity, very demanding, very strict ethical discipline. And I stop here, and I thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much, Matteo. That was a fantastic presentation, very interesting. I'm sure we'll have some discussion. Any questions, comments that anybody wants to raise? Okay, if there aren't any questions, I'd like to ask one. Somewhat of a complicated question, I guess, but I was wondering how you would chart kind of a phrase like non-Muslims, there is no salvation for non-Muslims. As it moves, that statement, as it operates within different kinds of social contexts, and how the illocutionary force modifies in dialogue with that. So in other words, somebody's saying this by themselves in a room as part of a prayer versus in a community of believers who all agree with that statement versus in a larger Muslim community in which only certain people agree with the statement versus within a larger social context in which large portions of the population, either some agree, some disagree. And kind of what is the role of performance as these different contexts change? In other words, I want to say this not merely as an expression of faith, but as a way of kind of performing among other Muslims and showing them that that I'm one of the group or whatever. So how do those very social dynamics impact how we might conceptualize the illocutionary force?
Thank you so much. Those are very important questions, and indeed they point to the argument I'm trying to develop. I should say that, of course, the book itself has the room to tackle the question from multiple angles, and therefore, yeah, some of your concerns have been addressed in the chapter. But yeah, it is so. Performance is indeed central, and indeed that's what I meant when I was saying that belief is somewhat secondary to what is going on here. I didn't have time to include one example, but I can share it now, of a friend whom I knew was a scripturalist friend who was also at the time university student, very well educated, very intellectually curious. And he was having a crisis of faith, uh, partly because there were some things that didn't add up. So, for example, we had this debate about creationism. There was this kind of ongoing conversation in our circle of acquaintances about creationism, whether it was a sort of indigenous Islamic thing or not. And so he couldn't wrap his head around that, and he was coming to the conclusion that creationism, which according to many in his own circle of pietists, is actually doctrinally justified as a position. He was like, there is no room this can square up with what I know of astrophysics and whatnot. So this is a problem. To him, that was a problem. One day I was with him, and another acquaintance dropped by at the cafe where we were having tea. And this other acquaintance was somewhat of a mentee of my friend's. So my friend had a sort of role of religious mentorship to this guy. And because of this ongoing conversation, this acquaintance, this mentee, brought up the issue of creationism and shared with my friend the same faith troubles. He was saying, listen, I don't know how to make this work. It strikes me as implausible. Maybe it's all wrong, right? What if it's all wrong? What if, slippery slope, this is wrong and all else is wrong? And I was surprised because my friend, whom I knew had his own doubts about it, he towed the line. It was like, no, right? I mean, there is such thing as revelation. Revelation is authoritative. You should talk to your imam. You should consult the relevant, sources of advice, theological advice. But basically, he performatively confirmed the creationist version. So after this guy, the mentee, left, I could have quizzed my friends. I know that you were sort of lying because I know that you yourself have troubles with that notion. But I didn't. I mean, I knew that what he was doing was fidemic. It was not about mounting an intellectual defense of creationism. It was about providing the right ethical guidance. So it was not a factual truth. It was an ethical truth that was at stake. And indeed, the context is crucial, is everything to understand these dynamics. And this is also why in sermons, even sermons delivered in scripturalist communities and scripturalist mosques, these kind of questions are not even raised. And of course, they're never raised by the official Islamic, the state-adjacent Islamic structures. The state Islamic bureaucracy position is particularly interesting here because on points of pure theology, they have no room to discard the theological. So even the most outlandish or strange or scripturalist truths, because they are, in as much as they are Islamic institutions, they must accept Islam as a package, which also includes some things that fly in the face of scientific rationality. So their compromise is that they basically don't say anything about it. They don't go as far as actually actually uttering things that might be perceived as disruptive. So in this kind of semi-public, or actually, well, let's say public settings of sermons, controversial or high intensity fidemic utterances are by and large not made, and the preacher will deliver more kind of, I suppose, safer content, which does not have that, maybe can be exhortations to be pious in other ways, but doesn't have that kind of disruptive quality. So it is indeed true that some things can be said in a private, intimate setting, some cannot be said in a public setting, and some will be decided on a case-by-case basis in specific religious pedagogical contexts. Sorry for a very lengthy reply.
No, that was very interesting.
Made some sense.
I'll leave the floor open for others who would like to raise questions or make a comment.
Well, I go. Well, thank you very much for your beautiful presentation, Matteo. It's wonderful to have you here and show several new aspects to add to our reflection on the illicit, let's say, right? Because the first event, it came out, the illicit as a contextual dimension. The second event, the focus that at least I got was that it is relational, so related also in relation, let's say, with both humans and non-humans. And what it is really calling my attention in your presentation is that, let's say, the outrageous, so they listed the outrageous is inherently political, and it is emancipatory. It can be emancipatory. So I would like you to tell us more about this dimension of the anarchic emancipatory dimension, or in relation also to what you say of the ethical discipline that is related to this. But also I would like also to highlight again that you gave us also other little facets to add to our reflection, that is the difference exactly between rule and law. That is very important for us, that sometimes we deal with words and sometimes we deal with, for example, in my case, right, with the illicit substances. And so also it is interesting to see how sometimes the illicit is related to materiality and to behaviors and to objects and to words. So we are expanding in a certain way what, like the different contexts, but also the objects that can be so impalpable sometimes as words, even though we know that utterances can be very performative and creating words and situations. But yeah, so there are all these elements that you put in the conversation, and for this I thank you. What about the emancipatory dimension of this?
Thank you so much, Piera. Very super apropos observations, and it also allows me to clarify the sort of intellectual ambition, I guess, of the project, which, as I make quite clear, actually quite explicit in the volume itself, it is at least in part, not exclusively, but in part, my response to David Graeber's call for an anarchist anthropology. And an anarchist anthropology is not only about did I do this? Well, it's not only about kind of picking sympathetic lefty or radical subject of study, but also, even perhaps more importantly, to interrogate the ethnographic realities that we encounter in a way that sort of is out to find fragments or possibilities or intimations of some kind of liberated life. And Graeber calls specifically for, in his call for an anarchist anthropology, and I'm not a Graeberian, like I just think that there's something valuable and worthwhile in his call. And he says that there should be like an anarchist anthropologist should provide an anarchist theory of non-state political entities, of voluntary associations, and political happiness. And I want to make the point that even though my interlocutors, the kind of milieu that I have researched, are very much quietistic, like they're quietists, that ends the title. They're not political Islamists in the classical sense. And yet they operate under a specific theory of political happiness, which is very much political. It is indeed very political. And the political happiness is indeed this kind of ability to flee, to escape, to subtract themselves from the normed, the institutionalized domain of the sayable. So words are so crucial. Of course, it's not only a matter of words, it's also a matter of how you dress. It's also a matter of how you comport yourself. It's also a matter of a range of other things, behaviors and attitudes and dispositions. But words are very important. And the way you organize your private life. Now, from, again, a sort of secularist, liberal viewpoint, a lot of what these communities do would not strike us as particularly emancipatory if we focus on the content, because the point is, of course, to subject yourself voluntarily to a strict discipline and doing things that basically bereave you of a degree of freedom. That's a classical argument. But what I'm trying to say is that in some contexts, and certainly in a context like Putin's Russia, and in a context where these people really very much come to this discipline out of their own volition, they're all converts, although they might have, their families might have Muslim backgrounds because of the history of the region. But after atheism, it's really a matter of choice whether or not you want to embrace high intensity, demanding, ethical Islam. And for those who do, that's a matter of political emancipation. Those communities, those subjectivities, have carved out spaces where they decide for themselves which norms apply to their lives. And of course, they have to compromise because law is never far, right? I mean, they always have to weigh the options. So, for example, in Islamic jurisprudence, insurance is a bit doubtful. So a lot of my interlocutors would to our own devices will not insure our cars because that's sort of Islamically a bit dubious. But we do not want to, it's a state law. We're supposed to do it. We'll do it because there's worse things than insuring your car. There's such things as civic strife. We don't want to challenge our government, so we'll do it. So again, it's really a matter of contextually sort of adjusting and not creating a wholly autarkic bubble which is separated, insulated from the political domain of Putinist Russia. In fact, it's a matter of using the structures of Putinist Russia, but within those structures, creating spaces of sociality, of moral life, of ethical life, where people feel they call the shots, and where people feel that sovereignty does not belong to Putin, does not belong to the official Islamic structures, does not belong to the local government. It belongs to God. And in as much as Islam is a very, in a sense, democratic religion where people have the responsibility to implement God's sovereignty on earth, sovereignty is theirs, in as much as it conforms with God's demand. In a sense, the authority is inescapable. We know this since the 1970s, Foucault. But there is something emancipatory about locating the ultimate locus of authority in God as opposed to some temporal ruler, if it makes sense.
Great. Interesting conversation. Any other comments or
Yeah.
questions that anybody? Yes, Franca.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Matteo, for the presentation. It's very interesting, very dense, incredibly dense. And I'm afraid I haven't read your book yet, so following everything that you brought up, it's very challenging. But I'd like to just ask something, some ethnographic clarification first. And perhaps if I understood Joseph's comments correctly, I'd like to know something more about the corresponding or correspondent practices, performances to these outrageous utterances. And so shifting your presentation is very much on utterances. That's the topic, but utterances, of course, happen in context, going back to the sociolinguists, and so these contexts are as important as. So on top of the content of the utterances, what I'd like to know ethnographically is the accent, the of these utterances, the metalinguistics kind of dimensions of what these people, how, not the what, but the how these people utter these outrageous utterances, and the how changes or renders their utterances more or less challenging and indeed outrageous, or less outrageous, or just matter of fact. So I'd like to know something about the how of the performance, and not only the content, and something more about the audience. The audiences, and meaning that are there any audiences who are more or less outraged by such utterances? So we go back to the context when these utterances are performed, how they are performed, and to the benefit of whom they are performed. And because this, really, if we intend performance as something is co-produced, between a speaker and the audience, the meaning of these utterances are produced by the people who listen and the people who or speak. So yeah, something. And again, probably in your book you talk about knowing the other book. You talk about the practices and performances and all these things, but I haven't read this work yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franca. Yeah, of course, I worried that the presentation would be too dense. I hope it does give a sort of at least a sense of what my argument tries to do, where it gets at, and I'm very much happy to keep unpacking it. And I myself have just received the book, so the book is really very, very fresh from publication, and
by the way, sorry if I interrupt you, but I'd
don't
like
worry.
to tell everybody that the book, Matteo's book, will be presented at the laboratorio there. Do you remember the date? So
I
you're
think
all
it's the
invited.
6th. No, wait. I should have it here. It could be, I think it's the 9th of March.
Yeah,
March the
I'm going
9th.
while you're replying to me. I'm going to check the date. I'm going to.
Yeah. Do double check, please, folks. So excellent questions indeed. As you point out, accent, the sort of the somatic nuance is vital to contextualize this stuff. For the sake of brevity, I didn't go into details today. there's a whole spectrum that goes from earnestness to irony. And especially the irony part is particularly interesting because some of my closest friends in the field, who are still good friends, tend to be, I call them intellectuals in a slightly inappropriate use of this term, meaning that like my friend who was the mentor of the other guy, he was very apt at seeing that more than one thing can be true at the same time at different levels. So there's a sort of irony in knowing that when you say something like the world was created in 6 days, you're sort of accepting that you could, under different circumstances, call that into question. So there is something, especially a certain type of my interlocutors is particularly amenable to going about this stuff in an ironic way. But I would say it's not a majority. And earnestness and sort of working on yourself to suppress doubt is part of this path of or program of self-cultivation. Now, the very fact that people need to and explicitly talk about suppressing doubt or sort of whittling doubt down until you are left with certainty is proof that doubt is there. I mean, people will tell me, even after years of this, I still struggle with some things. There is an element of which is both performative and sincere. In fact, I don't think that in the specific case there is a contradiction between those two. Sincerity is a category which is very much conceptualized among my own interlocutors. And interestingly, their understanding of sincerity is very much performative. The idea being that even if you are alone, so talking about audiences, there is no such thing as loneliness in these people's cosmology because you're always in the company of God. And God is always your audience. And as such, you're always performing. There's always an audience, there's always somebody benevolently, but still controllingly, sort of taking note of everything you do, your own thoughts, your composing. And, it's a merciful, very very generous and capacious audience, but still quite nerve-wracking. So I would say that we can maybe imagine this as a set of concentric circles for the sake of anthropological diagramming, right? I mean, the core audience is God. Then there's the self. I mean, again, it's really a matter of telling things to yourselves through God, perhaps. But it's people who have this kind of inner dialogue, they really conceptualize this notion that as part of their responsibilities as Muslims is to keep chart of your thoughts, of your actions, sort of doing a exam of consciousness, we would say, perhaps. So keeping track of your own doubts, convictions, ideas is part of the performance, and you are simultaneously actor and audience. Then there's this proximate social sphere. In the book, I again draw on Giorgio Agamben's work on monasticism and call this dimension form of life, not in the more well-known, perhaps, Wittgensteinian sense, but in a more restricted, specific Agambenian sense. So the form of life in this context is basically everybody who shares the ethical commitment of the utterers of my interlocutors. And a form of life, again, exists as the result, as a sort of interpersonal manifestation of a bunch of people coming together and sharing this kind of commitment and trading in this kind of utterances. They don't see those utterances as outrageous when they are exchanged in their midst. And yet, I think that it is understood that when you're saying something like that, the temperature in the room goes up 1, 2, 3 notches, like that you are doing something, that you are excluding somebody, that you're in a way raising the stakes. And by saying certain things, you're forcing your people in your proximate vicinity to either walk away or say, "Yep, I'm in this." It's a bit of an act of burning bridges. After you say certain things, there's no walking back.
Yeah,
So it
but who
does
walks
have,
away and who remains, for instance?
well, I mean, an anthropologist would not walk away. So I would stay, but even I was like, what am I doing here? Like, is this
Oh,
the
have
right?
you seen people
Are these people?
walking away and not wanting to?
And I'm sure, I mean, again, there are people who perhaps, hang out in the mosque, go to the Friday prayers, go to the kind of broad social. I have actually met people who are like, no, this stuff is too much for me. Like they are weird. Like people say crazy things. That's not my crowd. So it has this kind of kryptonite effect to some, maybe even to many. So yeah, that kind of potential to clarify who is in for the ethical long haul and who's actually, for now at least, not ready, is definitely part of the illocutionary effect of these statements. And then there's the broad, the outside, and there it's a mess because it very much depends on whose ears this kind of stuff falls on, and how do we react, and whether people will denounce you as an extremist. At this point, those who had to leave Russia have already, many of them had already left Russia by the time of my fieldwork. But it was, it's still a matter that if you insist on saying things, and after 1, 2, 3 notifications from the above that you should better watch your tongues, and you still carry on saying certain things, there will be consequences. So it very much depends, on individual situation, exposure, profile, and also the arbitrary. There's an element in my book. I talk about the stupidity of security apparatuses who are very prone to misreading harmless statements, even harmlessly bonkers statements about religious truth. Many of these people would misread those statements, people in the security services, as proof of extremist and dangerous radicalization. But that is in part due to the performative stupidity and obtusity of the security people themselves. So at that point, politics begins, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. You have to go on a case-by-case basis.
We have one more question from Davide, and then
I'm happy to stick around for
yeah,
for another few minutes,
stick around
as long as we can.
A few more minutes. Davide, did you want to raise your question?
Yeah. Do you hear me? Do
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so Theo, thanks for your talk, which was very dense, and congratulations for your book. I have a small question. So you just mentioned, like a couple of minutes ago, sincerity, and I do wonder whether the excessive quality of what you call fidemic speech, performative, provocative utterances, and the like, may have something to do with lying, actually. So I'm thinking of a certain philosophical literature on lying, with which, by the way, I'm not familiar, to be honest. One name that comes to my mind is Neri Marsili, is an Italian scholar whom I once met. So we usually say that someone lies only if they assert what they believe to be false. So are you, your educated informants, lying? Lying can also involve beliefs about graded truth values. You know, we can say fuzzy lies and graded beliefs lies. So is there an ethical commitment involved in lying as well? Have you ever thought about looking at your utterances in this way? And do you think there's, philosophically speaking, any common ground with lying?
It's an excellent, difficult question. I'm sure there is common ground with the philosophy online, which, to be honest, I'm also not that familiar with, and I accept the challenge. I should read up more on this, starting from Marsili, whom I also didn't know. I suppose there's different theories of truth out there, and by what I gauge from your words, I suppose that Marsili and I think a lot of the analytical philosophy on lying, especially coming from the kind of Anglo tradition of assessing the degrees of truth of a statement, uh, more often than not, although again I need to read up more on this, would focus on the factuality or facticity of a statement, the adherence to a state or a condition in the world that is verifiable. Um, and we can objectively reach a position of falsifiability, essentially. I I sort of sidestepped, I suppose, the issue of lying by embracing not for myself, although in part also for myself, but I sort of mobilizing a theory of truth which is very prominently not interested with the factual component, with the verifiability of a statement. In a sense, again, I summarized Badiou's argument, which is gigantic. I mean, the guy is, of course, a prolific writer, a very complicated writer, and I butchered his philosophy to suit my own purposes. But what I find fascinating about his proposition is that essentially he's providing philosophical justification for the concept of higher truth that kind of hover above the domain of the factual, the verifiable, the observable, the objective. So when we enter that domain, and that domain is, is essentially a domain of faith. There is something, Badiou says that a truth cannot be explained. It can be lived, can be encountered, it can even be rejected. It's not, it's binding once you have decided to embrace it, but you have this option to basically just ignore it. And you will remain on that kind of ontological horizon of verifiable or disprovable facts. But if you choose to embrace the truth, well, that is essentially a leap into faith, to use Kierkegaardian arguments. He talks about several domains of truth. One is politics, or he talks about communism. For all his being a Marxist, at the end of the day, you cannot prove Marxist to be right or wrong. You can either believe in it or not. But he also talks about love. Like, love is unverifiable. Love is a truth. You feel that something is true with your experience, with your whole being, and you express it through fidelity to that relationship. Once something is broken in that fidelity, the love is no longer there. The truth is no longer there. He also talks about art. He would say that, he doesn't do pop culture, but he would say something like punk rock is a truth because it is, a kind of ideal. Really, it's a matter of ideal that people need to be committed to. And so you are true in the same sense, and I know now we're talking a language that we can both understand. You're true to a certain aesthetic commitment. Imagine that in black metal, being true means to be committed to the truth of black metal. It's very, and the betrayal of truth is when you basically sell out, or you stop believing, or you stop performing a certain way. You stop performing your fidelity to the truth. Is that factual? Not at all. It's a matter of believing in the stuff. So I think that in part might answer. So I do believe, and this might be of interest to you, that there is a sort of homology of sorts between ethical truths and aesthetic truths, such as subcultural truths. So black metal say would be similar in a sense to Islam, although of course don't tell anybody that I just said something like this because it's a bit mad.
Well, on that note of black metal, we want to thank Matteo for a wonderful presentation. And real briefly to let you know about the next event, which Piera just put on the chat, which will be on the 18th of February by Daisy Vargas. And so it'll be a very interesting presentation, but it's important to note that that presentation will not be recorded. So if you want to see the presentation, you have to attend the event. So I just want to thank...
To cut the final bit of this presentation. I'm kidding. Just let it be.
So I just want to thank again our speaker. It was a wonderful presentation followed by a very interesting conversation. So looking forward to seeing everyone at the next event. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful...
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.